February 23rd, 1943. A quiet, sun-drenched bend in the Columbia River in eastern Washington state. The rural towns of Hanford and White Bluffs are active farming communities. Apricot, cherry, and peach orchards stretch across the arid valley, fed by a network of irrigation canals. It's an isolated, prosperous pocket of the Pacific Northwest. Then, a government town car kicks up dust on a dirt road. A military officer steps out and hands a bewildered farmer a single piece of paper. An eviction notice. Under the War Powers Act, the residents are given just 30 days to pack up their lives, surrender their properties for pennies on the dollar, and leave. Their land now belongs to the War Department. There is no negotiation. Bulldozers arrive before the last families even finish packing their trucks. Today, if you stand in that exact same spot, the orchards are gone, the homesteads are erased. In their place sits 586 square miles of barbed wire, security gates, and massive concrete monoliths. It is the most contaminated site in the Western Hemisphere. But in the 4 years between that 1943 eviction and the end of the Second World War, this desolate stretch of sagebrush desert became an industrial powerhouse. An overnight metropolis of 50,000 people sprang from the dirt. For a brief time, it was the fastest growing city in the world. And it was completely off the map. Tens of thousands of tradesmen poured concrete and built massive factories here, never knowing what they were actually manufacturing. The scale of this hidden city and the catastrophic environmental debt it left behind is a massive industrial puzzle. We're going to look at the boomtowns, the corporate machinery, and the buried secrets that built this place. Consider subscribing. To understand how a farming valley became a classified radioactive factory, look at the wartime pressure of 1942. General Leslie Groves and the Manhattan Engineer District were in a frantic race to build the first atomic weapon. The theoretical physics were largely established. What they lacked was the physical fuel. They needed plutonium. Mass-producing this new synthetic element required three specific things: uninterrupted electricity, a massive supply of cold, fresh water to cool the reactors, and absolute isolation to prevent espionage or a public health crisis if something blew up. Eastern Washington had all three. The new Grand Coulee Dam provided cheap, limitless power. The Columbia River offered cooling water, and the high desert gave them the isolation they needed. The military brought in the DuPont Corporation as the primary civilian contractor. Their task was insane: build the world's first full-scale nuclear production facility from scratch. The science was unproven outside the lab, and the entire project had to be kept secret. A massive corporate recruitment campaign targeted laborers and tradesmen across the country. Trains rolled into the nearby desert outpost of Pasco, unloading thousands of workers every week. These recruits were promised excellent wages and unlimited hot meals for their role in a vital war effort. They were told absolutely nothing else. The construction camp, officially designated as the Hanford Engineer Works, exploded into a temporary city. The logistics of sustaining this hidden workforce were staggering. The site had over 1,100 buildings. Mess halls operated around the clock, capable of serving 10,000 people at a single sitting. It required 8 post offices, a dedicated police force, and a commercial bus system rivaling Chicago or New York. All of this was built in a desert prone to blinding windstorms. The workers called them termination winds, because the intense dust would prompt hundreds of guys to quit on the spot. Even so, 50,000 people lived in a city that didn't legally exist. How do you keep a population that large from realizing they are building a nuclear facility? You compartmentalize everything. The military managed this workforce through strictly enforced ignorance. If you were a welder, you got blueprints for a 200-foot section of pipe. You welded it. You had no idea what connected to the other end. Electricians wired heavy, windowless concrete structures without knowing what machinery would go inside. Military police closely monitored the work sites and mess halls. If you asked too many questions about what the site was actually for, or speculated aloud over dinner, you were quietly escorted to the main gate and fired. Strict censorship meant every letter sent home was read and heavily redacted. The workers just accepted the mystery. They called whatever they were building the gimmick. The physical architecture was colossal. At the edge of the Columbia River, laborers built the B reactor, the first large-scale nuclear reactor ever engineered. The structure required 390 tons of structural steel, 17,400 cubic yards of concrete, and 2,000 tons of precisely machined graphite blocks. Further out in the desert, safely distanced from the reactors, workers built the chemical separation plants. These were heavily shielded concrete structures known as Queen Marys because their length mirrored ocean liners. Inside these narrow canyons, irradiated uranium would eventually be chemically dissolved by remote control to extract the plutonium, but there was a massive problem with the original engineering blueprints. The chemical extraction process used to isolate plutonium was incredibly inefficient. To harvest a piece of plutonium the size of a hockey puck, technicians had to dissolve thousands of pounds of uranium in corrosive nitric acids. The byproduct was a highly radioactive, reactive liquid sludge. Under normal conditions, a corporation would halt production until they found a safe disposal method for the hazardous waste. But it was 1944. The military had one goal. There was no time and no budget for long-term environmental planning. The mandate was just to produce the plutonium and win the war. They would figure out the waste problem later. DuPont and military engineers designed a quick stopgap measure, underground storage tanks. These were single-shell carbon steel vessels encased in concrete, buried deep in the desert sand. They were engineered strictly as a temporary fix, meant to contain the liquid waste for 10 to 20 years tops. The construction crews pouring the concrete and welding the steel assumed they were building standard water or aviation fuel storage. They had no idea these tanks would soon hold millions of gallons of boiling, irradiated chemical stew. In late 1944, the B reactor finally went critical. The cooling system began drawing tens of thousands of gallons of water a minute directly from the Columbia River. It flushed through the hot reactor core and dumped straight back into the ecosystem. Out in the chemical separation canyons, the first batches of irradiated fuel were processed. The engineering worked. The plutonium was extracted, sealed in heavy lead casks, and quietly shipped out of the Washington desert to a classified laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The 50,000 workers at Hanford had done exactly what they were paid to do. They built the industrial machinery required to deliver the payloads that ended the war. The wartime objective was achieved, and the immediate global crisis was drawing to a close. But directly beneath the sprawling mess halls and the feet of the thousands of oblivious tradesmen who built the complex, a new crisis was taking shape. The temporary single-shell underground tanks were filling up fast. As the first lethal payloads left the site, an unmanaged, toxic byproduct was already beginning to seep into the dirt. When the war ended in 1945, a temporary military outpost in the remote desert should have just packed up its equipment and shut down. Instead, the Cold War turned this isolated site into a permanent industrial labyrinth. The Manhattan Engineer District dissolved. In 1946, the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, took total civilian control of the American nuclear apparatus. They knew the standoff with the Soviet Union demanded a massive arsenal. The desert outpost was no longer makeshift. It was the central engine of the arms race. To manage this permanent expansion, the government needed a corporate partner. The original civilian contractor handed over the keys, and the General Electric Company stepped in to run the 586 square mile site. Under GE, backed by AEC money, the complex became a rigidly zoned industrial empire. Urban planners and chemical engineers divided the landscape into strictly segregated zones, linked by miles of new rail lines and heavy-duty asphalt roads. Right along the edge of the Columbia River sat the 100 areas, home to the massive nuclear reactors. Several miles south, in a sector called the 300 area, workers managed the fabrication of uranium fuel elements. But the mechanical heart of the operation, and the source of its environmental crisis, sat right in the middle of the desert, up on the Central Plateau. This was the 200 area, and it's where the illusion of control really took hold. The Central Plateau was heavily fortified, ringed by deep perimeters of barbed wire, guard towers, and armed federal police. Access required strict security clearances and a vow of total silence. The tens of thousands of tradesmen, pipe fitters, and chemical operators working under GE were subjected to intense censorship. They were isolated from the outside world and heavily compartmentalized from one another. A worker calibrating a pressure valve in the 200 East area was strictly forbidden from discussing his daily tasks with an electrician wiring a pump house in the 200 West area. This enforced ignorance allowed the AEC and its contractors to mask a growing logistical nightmare. To meet the aggressive new production quotas demanded by Washington, the chemical separation plants on the Central Plateau were operating at a grueling pace. Miles of underground transfer lines connected the massive processing canyons to subterranean tank farms. Operators in shielded control rooms routinely ordered the transfer of millions of gallons of corrosive, radioactive sludge out of the factories and into the desert floor. The mechanical stress on this infrastructure was immense. The initial wartime stopgap measure, those single-shell carbon steel tanks encased in concrete, now bore the weight of a permanent industrial supply chain. As the arms race intensified, the AEC authorized the construction of even more of these primitive tanks. Eventually, 149 single-shell tanks would be buried in the soil of the Central Plateau. Some were vast subterranean domes capable of holding 1 million gallons each. But a new chemical reality was unfolding inside those underground vaults. In the early 1950s, to increase efficiency and recover unused uranium, chemical engineers transitioned to an extraction method known as the redox process. This new chemical cocktail altered the byproduct flowing into the tank farms. The waste was no longer just a corrosive liquid. It was a complex mixture of heavy metals, toxic organic solvents, and intense radioactive isotopes. As specific isotopes, primarily strontium-90 and cesium-137, decayed inside the steel vessels, they generated massive amounts of radiolytic energy. The sludge was physically cooking itself. Deep underground, entirely out of sight, millions of gallons of waste were self-boiling. Temperatures inside the enclosed tanks routinely exceeded 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Site engineers in 1952 were managing an underground tank farm built of carbon steel and standard concrete. The materials expanded and contracted under extreme thermal stress. Aggressive chemical salts in the boiling waste actively precipitated, dropping to the bottom of the tanks and forming a dense, hardened crust. Beneath this crust, pockets of hydrogen and nitrous oxide gas built up, creating severe internal pressure. To prevent these tanks from tearing themselves apart or causing a vapor explosion, engineers retrofitted the system. They installed massive airlift circulators, essentially giant mechanical agitators, to continuously stir the boiling sludge and to release the trapped gases. They added external condensers to capture the radioactive steam venting off the waste, turn it back into liquid, and route it right back into the tanks. The underground infrastructure was buckling. The carbon steel corroded from the aggressive nitrates. The outer concrete shells, subjected to relentless heat, began to dry out and fracture. The original lifespan of these tanks was calculated at roughly 2 decades. The AEC knew they were pushing an already flawed design past its breaking point. Yet the bureaucracy of the arms race offered no leniency. When the Soviet Union successfully detonated its own atomic device, panic swept through the Pentagon. Production at the site could not pause to develop a safer, permanent waste management facility. The corporate contracts used a cost-plus model, heavily incentivizing the uninterrupted delivery of weapons-grade material. The overriding directive from the federal government was clear: keep the assembly line moving, keep the reactors running, and keep pumping the sludge into the desert. Oversight of this failing subterranean network was remarkably primitive. To measure the volume of boiling waste and check for anomalies, operators manually opened heavy steel risers at the surface and dropped a specialized tape measure down into the steaming, highly radioactive abyss. If the liquid level dropped, it could mean the liquid was simply evaporating from the intense heat. Or it could mean something much worse. But acknowledging structural failure wasn't an option in a rigidly compartmentalized military-industrial complex. Internal memos discussing the thermal stress on the tank farms were highly classified. The civilian workforce on the surface was shielded from the reality of the thermal dynamics happening just 30 feet below their boots. They clocked in, drove the patrol roads, maintained the pumps, and earned their paychecks, completely unaware that the ground beneath the Central Plateau harbored an unstable, boiling chemical puzzle no one knew how to solve. The AEC had successfully built an illusion of total technological control. Behind the barbed wire, they presented a disciplined, scientifically rigorous operation. But beneath the surface, it was a rapidly deteriorating holding pattern, and the pressure was only mounting. As the 1950s pushed forward, the demand for greater atomic yields required faster processing times. The cooling period, the time irradiated uranium sat and naturally decayed before being dissolved in the chemical canyons, was drastically shortened to meet deadlines. Engineers knew that rushing the chemical separation process would release vast amounts of volatile isotopes. The ground beneath them was quietly fracturing under the strain of boiling sludge. Now, the atmosphere above was about to be deliberately compromised, turning an entire region of unwitting civilians into subjects of a classified, devastating experiment. The drive for greater atomic yields in the 1950s tore up the physical geography of the site. To meet the Pentagon's aggressive quotas, engineers couldn't just rely on a single wartime facility anymore. General Electric expanded the footprint, eventually building 9 nuclear production reactors. These concrete and graphite monoliths lined the banks of the Columbia River like silent, windowless fortresses. A single nuclear reactor running at full capacity generates massive residual heat. 9 of them operating at once required a cooling system on a scale rarely seen. So the Columbia River itself was drafted into the supply chain. Intake pumps drew tens of thousands of gallons of cold, fresh river water every single minute. They forced this water directly through the scorching reactor cores to prevent meltdowns. Then, after a brief holding period, they discharged it right back into the main current. The river absorbed the shock. The thermal load alone artificially raised the water temperature and altered the spawning cycles of native salmon. But there was a secondary, invisible burden. As the river water rushed past the irradiated fuel, trace minerals were bombarded with neutrons, creating radioactive activation products like zinc-65 and phosphorus-32. These isotopes flushed downstream, slipping right into the aquatic food web. The government monitored the outflow, but their standard protocol was just dilution. The river is huge. The assumption was that the sheer volume of moving water would scatter the liability before it reached the Pacific Ocean. But the river was just one disposal method. The atmosphere was about to be used for something much more calculated. Standard operating procedure dictated that irradiated uranium fuel had to sit in heavily shielded cooling basins for at least 90 to 120 days before processing. Under normal safety protocols, this wait was non-negotiable. It gave highly volatile, short-lived radioactive isotopes, specifically iodine-131, time to naturally decay to manageable levels. But the early days of the Cold War didn't care about normal safety protocols. American intelligence had detected signs that the Soviet Union was refining its own plutonium. The military desperately needed to know how fast the Soviets were moving. To do that, the Air Force had to develop airborne sensors capable of detecting the chemical signature of a rushing, heavily stressed plutonium factory. To build that system, they needed a radiological baseline and a test subject. On the night of December 2nd, 1949, site directors authorized a highly classified experiment known internally as the Green Run. Chemical operators in the 200 area canyons were ordered to bypass standard cooling times. They took a batch of green, highly volatile, freshly irradiated uranium fuel that had been cooling for just 16 days. They loaded it into the chemical dissolvers, and to ensure the maximum possible atmospheric release, operators deliberately turned off the facility's filtration scrubbers. As corrosive nitric acid ate into the raw fuel, an unfiltered plume of radioactive gas rushed up the 200-foot exhaust stacks and billowed into the freezing night sky. Air Force planes equipped with specialized filters immediately took flight, crisscrossing the airspace to track the invisible cloud. Original meteorological models predicted that high-altitude winds would carry the plume in a narrow, controlled band, letting the military safely calibrate their instruments. But Pacific Northwest weather rarely cooperates. Shortly after the release, the wind shifted, stalled, and forced the heavy plume back down to the surface. Between 7,000 and 11,000 curies of iodine-131 blanketed a huge swath of civilian territory. The fallout settled over the agricultural towns of eastern Washington, drifted heavily into Spokane, and swept south into Oregon. No alarm sounded, no public warnings went out. The citizens of the surrounding valleys woke up the next morning, went to work, and sent their children to school. They had no idea a heavy dusting of synthetic radioactive isotopes had just settled over their homes and fields. Iodine-131 is exceptionally good at finding its way into the human body. The atmospheric fallout coated the broad leaves of native sagebrush and sprawling alfalfa fields. Local dairy cows grazed on this contaminated vegetation, concentrating the isotope in their milk. Within days, that milk was bottled, distributed, and poured onto the breakfast tables of thousands of families. When you ingest iodine-131, your body doesn't recognize it as a toxin. The endocrine system just absorbs it as standard iodine, shuttling it directly into the thyroid gland, where the radioactive isotope becomes permanently lodged. The military secured their tracking data, classified the Green Run experiment at the highest level of state secrecy, and filed the reports away. For decades, the surrounding civilian populations, later known as the downwinders, were treated as unwitting variables in an undocumented health trial. As the years passed, mysterious health anomalies began popping up in these rural communities. There were steep, unexplained spikes in severe thyroid complications and chronic autoimmune conditions. Entire families working the farms reported overlapping medical crises. Local doctors were baffled. Without access to the classified logs, there was no environmental context to explain the clustering of these ailments. The government just maintained a wall of total silence. While the sky above had been temporarily weaponized, the physical infrastructure buried in the soil below was failing. The new production reactors meant the chemical separation canyons were running continuously. The sheer volume of highly corrosive, boiling sludge pumped into the Central Plateau's underground tank farms was breaking every logistical model the original engineers had drafted. To complicate matters, the plutonium extraction process was overhauled again in the mid-1950s. The site transitioned to the Purex process. This new method was much better at harvesting weapons-grade material, but it produced an even more chemically complex, highly acidic waste stream. When operators pumped this new Purex byproduct into the aging carbon steel tanks, the organic solvents started eating through the infrastructure at a terrifying speed. The thermal heat of the self-boiling sludge actually altered the holding vessels. The concrete encasements surrounding the steel liners were spalling. Extreme internal temperatures baked the moisture out of the concrete, causing it to turn brittle and fracture. The 149 single-shell tanks were chemically disintegrating in the dark. By the late 1950s, General Electric management faced impossible math. The 9 reactors were producing waste faster than new underground tanks could physically be dug and built. The existing network was hitting maximum capacity. If the tanks overflowed, the entire plutonium assembly line would have to stop. And under the intense pressure of the Cold War arms race, shutting down production was viewed as a national security failure. They deployed desperate measures to cheat the capacity limits. Site engineers kicked off huge scavenging campaigns. They built towering mechanical evaporators on the desert floor. Then, they pumped the boiling liquid waste out of the underground tanks, ran it through the evaporators to boil off the water, and pumped the concentrated radioactive slurry back underground. As this thickened sludge cooled in the subterranean vaults, it crystallized into a dense, rock-hard salt cake. This bought site managers a few extra million gallons of operational space. But it wasn't enough. The liquid volume kept rising. To avoid overflowing the tank farms, the corporate contractors made a brutal calculation. They began manually sorting the waste. The absolute most lethal, high-level boiling sludge went into the steel tanks. But the slightly less radioactive, intermediate-level liquid, millions upon millions of gallons of it, was simply diverted away from the holding tanks altogether. Engineers ordered bulldozers to carve deep, unlined trenches into the desert floor, calling them cribs. Tank farm operators then opened the valves and pumped heavily contaminated chemical water directly into the open soil. Their internal logic relied on a flawed assumption about the region's geology. Site geologists theorized that the deep columns of dry desert soil would act as a natural filter. They thought the heavy metals and radioactive isotopes would bind to the sand near the surface, allowing only clean water to eventually trickle down into the aquifer. It was a massive industrial gamble, driven entirely by the need to keep the factory running. On the surface, the illusion of a perfectly controlled scientific facility held up. The perimeter fences were secure, the production quotas were met, plutonium was steadily shipped out to fuel a global standoff. But 30 feet below ground, the system was tearing itself apart. The concentrated salt cakes trapped huge pockets of explosive gas, carbon steel walls steadily thinned from acid corrosion, and beneath the open soil trenches, the reality of the desert proved the geologists entirely wrong. The heavy isotopes weren't binding safely to the sand. They remained mobile, moving steadily downward through the earth. Site managers had pushed the aging infrastructure past its limits. It was only a matter of time before the steel tape measures dropped into the steaming underground vaults returned an impossible reading, forcing engineers to confront the exact scenario they had spent 2 decades desperately trying to avoid. The facade of a controlled scientific utopia is hard to maintain when the ground beneath your feet is physically collapsing. By the early 1970s, the image of the Central Plateau as a sterile industrial machine began to crumble. By this era, the massive, windowless concrete processing canyons of the 200 West area were decades old. Heavy steel doors rusted from years of exposure to alkaline vapors. Miles of underground transfer lines connecting the factories to the tank farms were eaten through with corrosion. The Cold War adrenaline that drove the initial construction boom had faded, replaced by bureaucratic apathy and a rotating cast of corporate defense contractors. The federal government managed this desert complex through short-term cost-plus contracts. When one corporation's tenure expired, or the liability grew too immense, a new contractor simply stepped in, signed the paperwork, and inherited the crumbling infrastructure. The Atlantic Richfield Hanford Company was handed the keys to the underground tank farms. Their mandate was identical to the last guy's: keep costs down and keep the chemical assembly lines running. Above all, never publicly acknowledge the mechanical degradation happening 30 feet below the soil. But chemistry and thermodynamics don't care about corporate non-disclosure agreements. The single-shell carbon steel tanks had been baking in their own radioactive heat since the 1940s. Organic solvents from the Purex process spent years eating away at the weld seams. In the spring of 1973, it caught up with them. Take the operational logs for Tank 106T, a 533,000-gallon subterranean dome filled with boiling, high-level liquid sludge. Monitoring its volume was entirely analog. Operators dropped a weighted steel tape measure down a vertical pipe to check the liquid level, recorded the data on a clipboard, and passed the logs up the chain of command. In early April 1973, the liquid level in Tank 106T began to drop. The data showed a clear discrepancy, but the supervisor on duty signed off on the paperwork without flagging it. A week later, another reading showed a steeper drop. Again, the logs were rubber-stamped and filed away. The oversight apparatus was hollow. For nearly 2 months, the liquid levels plummeted. No one in the control room sounded an alarm. It wasn't until June 8th that a technician looked at the cumulative data and realized the mathematical impossibility staring back at him. The liquid had not evaporated. It was gone. An estimated 115,000 gallons of radioactive, boiling chemical waste had bled out through a ruptured seam in the carbon steel wall. The liquid pooled at the bottom of the concrete encasement, found a fracture, and poured directly into the dry desert soil. When news of the 106T leak finally broke through military censorship, it shattered the illusion of containment. Internal audits and congressional inquiries unspooled a trail of negligence. Tank 106T wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first one they couldn't hide. Whistleblowers and independent hydrologists demanded access to historical site records. They uncovered a systemic pattern of structural failure that site managers had spent years burying in classified memos. The audits revealed that over 1 million gallons of boiling, high-level radioactive sludge had already leaked from at least a dozen different compromised tanks across the Central Plateau. The corporate contractors knew about the thinning steel. They tracked the dropping liquid levels. Yet they chose to reclassify these massive leaks as unplanned losses or soil absorption events, to avoid triggering a costly shutdown of the plutonium supply chain. They treated the desert floor as an endless, invisible sponge for their mechanical failures. But the soil beneath this industrial empire wasn't a bottomless void. The surface of the site is dry, windswept sagebrush. But drill down roughly 250 feet, and you hit a fast-moving subterranean aquifer. This immense body of groundwater flows on a direct gradient straight toward the Columbia River. When those 1 million gallons of boiling tank sludge hit the soil, they joined the millions of gallons of intermediate-level waste engineers deliberately dumped into unlined trenches during the 1950s. The original geological assumption that the dry sand would filter out the heavy isotopes was a catastrophic miscalculation. The complex chemical makeup of the waste acted as an accelerant. The acidic organic solvents carried the radioactive isotopes right past the binding sand particles, dragging them deeper into the earth. Once this toxic payload hit the water table, it began to spread horizontally. Deep beneath the workers on the surface, plumes of contamination were already moving. Hydrologists sinking test wells mapped out the underground destruction. They tracked slow-moving clouds of strontium-90, a highly mobile isotope that mimics calcium and settles directly into human bone marrow. Even more pervasive was a plume of tritium, a radioactive isotope of hydrogen that bonds with oxygen to create radioactive water, making it virtually impossible to filter out of the aquifer. It wasn't just radioactive material. The factories on the surface relied on immense quantities of toxic chemicals to keep the machinery from rusting. To prevent the cooling pipes inside the production reactors from corroding, engineers treated the systems with sodium dichromate. The byproduct was hexavalent chromium, a persistent chemical carcinogen. For decades, operators simply flushed countless tons of this hexavalent chromium into the soil and out the reactor outflow pipes. Now, an underground plume of heavy metal was sweeping toward the riverbanks, threatening the region's salmon runs and the drinking water for downstream municipalities. The volume of the migrating contamination was hard to grasp. The government built an overnight empire to win a global war, but they poisoned the earth that supported it. As the 1970s pushed into the 1980s, the geopolitical realities that justified this environmental sacrifice shifted. The American nuclear stockpile reached an unprecedented peak. The military didn't need any more weapons-grade material, and the relentless demand that drove the chemical canyons to operate around the clock evaporated. One by one, the aging production reactors lining the Columbia River powered down. The control rods were lowered. The heavy intake pumps that drew billions of gallons from the river fell silent. Out on the Central Plateau, the massive chemical processing plants were placed into cold standby. The assembly line stopped. For a workforce of thousands whose local economy was tied exclusively to plutonium, it was a harsh pivot. The product was finished, but the byproduct remained. Federal agencies finally had to look at the balance sheet of the Manhattan Project. Stripped of the patriotic urgency of wartime production, the true cost of the site was laid bare. 56 million gallons of irradiated chemically reactive sludge were boiling in 149 failing underground tanks. Hundreds of square miles of contaminated groundwater were actively moving toward a major commercial waterway. Millions of cubic yards of solid radioactive debris sat buried in unlined, undocumented trenches. The Department of Energy inherited the site. They transitioned the 586 square mile complex from a top-secret military production facility into the largest environmental remediation project in human history. But transitioning a polluted weapons facility into a cleanup operation requires a different kind of corporate machinery. It takes billions of dollars in federal funding, a new army of specialized civilian contractors, and a lucrative bidding process. The military imperative had ended, but the industrial grift was just beginning. As the budget for environmental remediation skyrocketed into the billions, a new generation of corporate entities arrived in the desert, promising to engineer a permanent solution to the boiling earth. They signed the contracts, took the money, and attempted to build a waste treatment facility that would ultimately expose an entirely new level of institutional rot. In 1989, the federal government signed the Tri-Party Agreement, a sweeping legal pact between the Department of Energy, the EPA, and the state of Washington. The mandate sounded simple: clean up the site, secure the soil, protect the river. Without the patriotic urgency of wartime production, a new economic reality settled over the eastern Washington desert. The product was no longer plutonium, it was the cleanup itself. Billions of taxpayer dollars poured into remediation budgets. Contractors arrived, promising permanent high-tech fixes for the sprawling underground wasteland. They drafted ambitious timelines and signed cost-plus contracts that guaranteed profit regardless of actual progress. The local workforce, facing heavy layoffs from the reactor shutdowns, simply traded their production badges for remediation badges. Yet the culture of the site barely changed. The military secrecy of the Cold War gave way to the corporate obscurity of modern defense contracting, setting the stage for massive institutional grift. Take the centerpiece of this cleanup effort, the waste treatment and immobilization plant. The strategy was called vitrification. Engineers designed a complex process to pump the boiling sludge out of the failing underground tanks, mix it with silica, and heat the radioactive mixture to 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. The molten slurry would then be poured into massive stainless steel cylinders to slowly cool into solid glass logs. Entombed in glass, the radioactive isotopes would be immobilized, permanently kept out of the water table. On paper, vitrification made sense. In practice, building the facility turned into a financial black hole. To speed things up, the government authorized a design-build contract. Corporate managers could start physically building the plant before the engineering blueprints were finished. They poured tens of thousands of cubic yards of concrete and laid miles of piping based on assumed scientific models. Then the physics caught up with them. Independent engineers reviewing the blueprints flagged a catastrophic flaw. The waste in the underground tanks wasn't a uniform liquid. It was a heavy, unpredictable mix of dense metallic sludges and crystalline salts. The plant's internal piping wasn't designed to maintain the velocity needed to keep this thick slurry moving. If the sludge settled in the pipes, it would block them. A blockage would trap the intense thermal heat. An overheating pocket of high-level waste could trigger an explosion right inside the new multi-billion-dollar factory. Construction ground to a halt. Whole sections of the plant had to be ripped apart and re-engineered. Deadlines evaporated. The original budget was roughly $4 billion. As contractors missed benchmarks, redesigned the architecture, and cycled through management teams, the price tag climbed into the tens of billions. Year after year, the unfinished steel skeleton of the vitrification plant sat in the desert, swallowing federal funding without processing a single drop of waste. While the waste treatment facility stalled, the physical landscape of the rest of the site slowly transformed into a monument to industrial collapse. If you walk the banks of the Columbia River today, the original wartime reactors are barely recognizable. The government realized that safely dismantling these highly irradiated graphite and concrete structures was physically impossible with modern technology. Instead, they opted for cocooning. Laborers stripped away the auxiliary buildings, pump houses, and external cooling pipes. They left only the windowless central core housing the reactor block. They sealed every door, welded every seam, and encased the entire structure in steel and concrete. These gray monoliths now sit along the riverbank like brutalist warehouses. They are engineered to sit undisturbed for 75 years, allowing the volatile, short-lived radioactive isotopes in the core to naturally decay to a level where human demolition crews might one day safely approach them. They are literal monuments to a problem pushed onto a future generation. Further inland, out on the Central Plateau, cleaning up the chemical separation canyons, presented an immediate technological wall. Inside these canyons, the ambient radiation is so intense that humans can't enter. To map the debris and dismantle the heavy processing equipment, contractors deployed million-dollar robotic crawlers outfitted with high-definition cameras, hydraulic arms, and diamond wire saws. But the environment inside these crumbling concrete corridors destroys modern electronics. The intense radiation fields actually strip the electrons from the microprocessors. A crawler navigates a dark, chemically stained hallway, sending footage back to a shielded control room. Then, the video feed fills with static. The sensors overload. The hydraulic fluid lines, degrading in the toxic atmosphere, rupture. The machine dies. It freezes in the rubble. You can't send a mechanic in to retrieve it, and you can't swap out the fried motherboard. The robot simply becomes another piece of highly contaminated debris left to rot in the dark. Contractors eventually had to build secondary, heavier machines whose only real job was bulldozing the dead robots out of the way just to clear a path. But the most pressing crisis wasn't the dormant reactors or the crumbling canyons. The real threat remained exactly where it always had been, 30 feet below the desert floor inside the aging underground tank farms. By the 2000s, the single-shell tanks were well past their engineering lifespan. Crews were pumping the liquids into slightly newer double-shell tanks to prevent further ground leaks, but the thermal and chemical reactions inside the vaults didn't stop. The heavy sludges were constantly shifting, cooling, and burping up pockets of volatile organic compounds. The workers tasked with inspecting the surface gauges and maintaining the ventilation systems had to walk directly over these failing structures. They were told the air quality was safe and handed standard industrial protective gear. But the gas trapped inside those tanks is a highly pressurized, unpredictable cocktail of lethal chemicals, including dimethyl mercury, concentrated ammonia, and nitrous oxide. Periodically, these pressurized gases bypass the aging filtration systems and vented directly into the breathing zones of the workers on the surface. A technician would be walking the steel grating above a subterranean dome on a calm day. Suddenly, they'd smell a distinct metallic sweetness in the air, or the sharp scent of stale onions. Within minutes, the physical reaction would hit. Workers began staggering away from the tank farms with severe nosebleeds, intense metallic tastes in their mouths, and shortness of breath. Acute exposure to these concentrated chemical vapors triggered physiological collapses. Over the next few months and years, many of these laborers developed chronic neurological symptoms, profound cognitive decline, aggressive tremors, and respiratory failure. The corporate response was clinical. Site contractors initially dismissed the worker testimonies, categorizing the toxic vapor plumes in official safety logs as mere odor events. They argued that the stationary air monitors around the tank farms hadn't detected any sustained chemical breaches exceeding federal limits. But those monitors were designed to measure long-term, steady emissions. They completely missed the sudden, highly concentrated burps of toxic gas venting from specific pressure valves. The burden of proof was dumped entirely on the workforce. Laborers were forced into legal battles against the federal contractors employed to ensure a safe cleanup, fighting for basic medical compensation while their central nervous systems degraded. By the 2010s, the numbers surrounding the site ceased to make any economic sense. The cleanup budget blew past $100 billion. Federal auditors projected the ultimate cost could double or triple before a single glass log of waste was ever poured. Deadlines were pushed from 2020 to 2030, then quietly extended to 2050 and beyond. The government had funded a sprawling corporate empire dedicated entirely to moving contaminated dirt from one side of the desert to the other, building factories that didn't work and fighting its own poisoned workforce in court. The remediation effort is no longer a scientific project. It is a permanent economic fixture. The robots die in the darkness, the toxic vapors continue to vent, and the contractors keep collecting their checks while maintaining the illusion that this subterranean wasteland is under control. Drive out into the high desert of eastern Washington along Highway 240. The termination winds still sweep across the Columbia Basin, carrying the scent of dry sagebrush and dust. Look out across the horizon, and you won't see the fastest growing city in the world. The sprawling mess halls, heavy rail yards, and massive transit depots that once rivaled Chicago are gone. The secret metropolis of 50,000 people has been entirely erased from the map. When the construction camps were bulldozed at the end of the initial boom, the federal government didn't just dismantle the buildings, they erased the human footprint entirely. The original farming communities of Hanford and White Bluffs, a prosperous agricultural hub before the sudden 1943 eviction, were wiped out. All that remains is the crumbling concrete shell of a high school and a rusted bank vault standing isolated in a sea of dead grass. The vast irrigation canals that once fed apricot and cherry orchards were filled in, cutting off the water and starving the soil back into a sterile desert. You won't find historical plaques marking the neighborhoods where tens of thousands of tradesmen once lived in enforced ignorance. There is only a massive, restricted void guarded by layers of razor wire, checkpoints, and federal patrols. This 586 square mile expanse, half the size of Rhode Island, is now officially a national sacrifice zone. It's exactly what it sounds like. This piece of the American landscape has been formally written off, surrendered to extreme industrial contamination. The topsoil will never again support a commercial harvest, and the land will never host a neighborhood. Beneath the rusted radiation warning signs on the perimeter fences, 56 million gallons of heavily irradiated, chemically reactive waste simmer in the decaying underground vaults of the Central Plateau. Over the decades, the boiling sludges and highly acidic heavy metals have morphed into a synthetic geology. The dense salt cakes and corrosive liquids trapped inside those failing carbon steel shells hold immense concentrations of isotopes like plutonium-239, an element with a half-life of 24,000 years. Recorded human history spans roughly 5,000 years. The United States government, the institution legally bound to secure this site, is less than 250 years old. Yet the lethal material buried in this desert must stay perfectly isolated from the surrounding ecosystem for tens of thousands of years. This leaves the Department of Energy with a bizarre logistical puzzle. Site engineers, geologists, and theoretical linguists are trying to design physical warning markers that can communicate extreme radiological danger to civilizations that don't exist yet. They are drafting blueprints for heavy granite monoliths and subterranean magnetic anomalies meant to withstand the geologic shifts of the next ice age. They have to warn future populations to stay away from the boiling earth, using symbols that transcend modern English. The environmental bill for a 4-year war and the Cold War that followed has been passed down to a timeline that outlasts the concept of a nation-state. And the threat isn't waiting for the distant future. The battle to contain this subterranean wasteland is an active daily war of hydrological attrition. Down on the banks of the Columbia River, the surface water looks pristine as it cuts a wide, cold path through the arid gorge. But just beneath the soil along the shoreline, an invisible defensive line operates around the clock to keep massive underground plumes of hexavalent chromium and strontium-90 from breaching the riverbed. Contractors maintain a sprawling network of mechanical pump-and-treat systems. These immense subterranean vacuums continuously pull millions of gallons of heavily contaminated groundwater out of the deep aquifer. The water runs through industrial ion exchange filters to chemically strip away the radioactive isotopes, then gets injected right back into the earth to create an artificial pressure barrier. It is a perpetual, highly precarious holding action. If federal funding stops, or if the heavy diesel pumps lose power and the massive resin filters degrade, the defensive wall collapses. The radioactive plumes, driven by the natural gradient of the local water table, will simply resume their slow march into the region's primary freshwater artery. The entire downstream agricultural economy of the Pacific Northwest relies on these specific pumps never failing. This constant state of environmental triage reveals the institutional surrender at the heart of the modern Hanford Site. For decades, the public-facing narrative promised total remediation. Congress authorized massive multi-billion-dollar cleanup budgets under the assumption that the government would eventually scrub the desert, extract the toxic heavy metals, vitrify the boiling sludges, and return the land to its natural state. That illusion is gone. Federal regulators and site managers no longer draft operational timelines for cleaning the deepest, most compromised sections of the Central Plateau. The bureaucratic vocabulary in federal contracts has shifted to long-term stewardship and plume management. The goal is no longer a cure. It is permanent, heavily funded containment. The economic momentum required to maintain this holding pattern is staggering. The surrounding communities of Richland, Pasco, and Kennewick are modern boomtowns once again, with pristine suburban subdivisions and soaring real estate values. But their civic foundation is tethered directly to the disaster sitting just up the highway. The region demands billions of dollars in annual federal appropriations just to keep the perimeter fences secure and the groundwater pumps running. It's a massive, self-sustaining corporate ecosystem that produces absolutely nothing. The immense wealth flowing into this desert today is dedicated entirely to preventing a public health crisis. It's a reverse economy, driven solely by the need to manage the lethal legacy of the city that once stood here. The reality of this landscape offers a dark counter-narrative to the triumphs of the 20th century. The Manhattan Project and the Cold War expansion are usually remembered as pinnacles of American scientific brilliance and logistical ambition. Military historians study the overnight assembly lines and the rapid deployment of immense capital. They engineered the payloads, but they fueled the global standoff. But at the heavily guarded gate of the 200 areas today, you see the exact cost of that victory. The federal government used unparalleled executive power to evict an entire agrarian society. They recruited an army of working-class laborers, isolated them behind draconian military censorship, and commanded them to build an industrial empire without any long-term blueprint for survival. Driven by the panic of a global arms race, defense contractors and military planners treated their own soil as an expendable resource. They prioritized the relentless production of weapons-grade material over the very land that housed it. The outcome is a sprawling, irradiated monument to extreme government secrecy and unchecked administrative hubris. The mess halls and massive recreation centers where tens of thousands of workers once lived are gone. You can't walk the corridors of the immense chemical separation canyons, where the ambient air remains hostile to human life. Instead, you just look at the endless expanse of dry sagebrush, the sealed concrete reactor blocks sitting silently on the riverbank, and the miles of heavy chain-link fencing stretching into the distance. The fastest growing metropolis in the world successfully delivered the exact product it was built to manufacture, and in doing so, it guaranteed its own erasure. The true legacy of this hidden city isn't the groundbreaking physics it pioneered. It's the invisible poison left behind, a desolate, actively defended wasteland that will demand resources and caution from every human generation that follows.